Welcome to Chapter 12. This is the 13th edition, and today we are talking about racism, ethnicity, and how to advance things socially and economically. Being excluded from the group is a really hard thing, and it's hard on an individual basis. Maybe you've been excluded, not invited to hang out with people, maybe on the playground, maybe as an adult. When a people group is excluded, you get kind of the same results that you get on the playground. People don't feel good about themselves. People don't want to try. They don't want to engage. Maybe they engage in bullying behavior. Maybe they do things to make themselves feel better that they shouldn't, like taking drugs or things like that. The opportunity here is for social workers to be able to step in to say, one, that this is not okay, right? That's a major important thing for the discipline of social work to say racism, ethnocentrism, this is not okay. It's not just kind of the way things are, and you get to change the system. And on the individual level, you get to try to connect with people that are different from yourself and maybe have never had a professional try to extend the olive branch, trying to reach out and say, hey, I know we're different. I know that maybe your culture, your beliefs, your skin tone is different from mine, but I have done due diligence and I am trying to understand how to best help you. Right? Like that, it's just like there's a really powerful opportunity that's available here for all of us, and that includes everybody. So even if you're let's say you are already a minority status, like maybe you're a woman, but you're probably not all the other racial categories, and so everyone has the opportunity to reach a people group that is outside of their own group that maybe they're not that familiar with, but they can maybe look from the outside in and see, like, maybe I can help because I can see that these issues are occurring, right? And let me just say, it's more than just being nice. I mean, like, being nice is a great foundation. Like, obviously, like, if you're not nice, then maybe nothing else you're going to do is going to work, no matter how good you are. But it is more than that, right? It's more than, say, being colorblind. In fact, the research is showing that colorblind isn't that great of a solution, because for the person who is a person of color, and maybe the white person says, hey, I'm colorblind, I don't see, they're like, well, I have all these things to deal with in my life because I am a person of color, but you're pretending that you can't see color, so you don't see any of these things that make my life difficult. So I don't know, that's not going to be very helpful. Although I do kind of appreciate the sentiment in trying to say that I am not going to treat you differently because of your skin tone, or I'm not going to treat you worse, I suppose is probably what they're trying to say. So that's a nice sentiment there. So, all right, the learning objectives for this chapter, we're going to define a bunch of things related to minority status. We're going to talk about where prejudice and discrimination comes from, the effects and the costs. And then we're going to dive a little bit into the different racial groups, major racial groups in the United States. Here, I'm pointing like you can see, but you can't. There you go. We're going to outline some strategies for what can you do? What can you do to move the needle? Most people think there's nothing to be done. It's just the way that it is. It's always been that way. It's always going to be that way. Which just is like, okay, like, why don't we just crawl up in a hole and die? It's like, no, there actually are a lot of things you can do, and we've come a long way. We've come a long way. I am the result of our advancement, being Jewish, Italian, and Polish. My ancestry, those were three people groups that were discriminated against very heavily, and yet today I don't feel like I experience any discrimination based on my ethnicity, right? So we have made a lot of progress. I wish we'd made a lot more. I'm not saying we should stop, but I just want to say that we have made advances, and I'm hopeful for the future that advances will still be made, right? I mentioned social work's commitment to ending discrimination, and then a crystal ball. We have one of those. We're going to pull it out and find out what's going to happen in the future. So, all right, let's define some of these terms. An ethnic group is a group with a cultural background. I'm going to emphasize cultural background because race is biological, sort of. So culture, ethnic groups is culture. So if a people group that's different, they regard themselves as distinct. That's important. They think of themselves as distinct. Hey, we are the Puerto Ricans. We are the Catholics. We are the Hispanics, right? I don't know if vegans would be an example there, but you could argue that maybe they were due to dietary practices, right? It's a people group, and you can tell they're different because their culture, their foods, their music, their religion, things like that. So, all right. What does it look like when an ethnic group is discriminated against? What's the term for that? Ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is literally the word that our ethnicity is at the center, or like the center of the universe. That's us. And if you're like us, then you're cool. And if you are very different from us, how so? In your religion, in your language, in what you eat, in your history, where you come from, then we get to view you as less than us. I think about this as a little bit of ethnocentrism is probably okay, because if you didn't think that your group was the best, maybe you wouldn't pay your taxes or enlist in the armed services. A lot of it can be deadly. You know, you've probably heard of ethnic cleansing, right? What is ethnic cleansing? Well, it's the one ethnic group says that the other ethnic group, who's different in their religion and language and dietary practices, is dirty, so we're going to clean them out, usually by killing them or pushing them off our land. All right, race and racism. I mentioned ethnicity has to do with culture. Race has to do with biology, or at least physical characteristics, right? What physical characteristics? Skin tone, amount of melanin in your skin, hair texture, eye shape, and facial structures, specifically brow, nose width, other things like that. The amount of hair, I guess. So from that comes racism. Racism is about the belief that one race is superior than other races. The thing about racism is that there's an idea behind it that the differences are very real and very big. The reality is humans are so similar one to another, more so than penguins and mosquitoes and all these other creatures that actually have a lot more genetic variability. Humans, except for just a couple of handfuls of like tribes and very, like indigenous tribes and kind of faraway places, are very similar one to another. And you are as likely to be genetically similar to somebody of a different race than you are of somebody of your own race, right? So like I'm as likely to be genetically similar as somebody who's Asian. I identify as European. I'm as likely to be similar to somebody who's Asian, who's a different race than me, than I am somebody who's European, who's the same race of me, because there's just not that much difference from one race to the next. But racism is at the idea that human capacities, like the ability to lead or the ability to be responsible, the ability to play chess, the ability to be an athlete, that those are related to race. We used to believe that Jewish people were just better at basketball because they were just born that way. And then for a while we believed that African Americans were just better at basketball because they were just born that way. Maybe we still believe that. I stopped following basketball a few decades ago. But you get the idea. It's this idea that some races are just like at their core different. The British used to believe that in the idea of a white man's burden. The white man's burden had to do with the burden to dominate the world, because they were just better at leadership and government than all the other races. That's an example of racism. All right, prejudice, discrimination, and racism. Prejudice is about prejudging. I know who you are because I know your group. You're not an individual. You are just one part of those people, and you're really no different. That's the idea of prejudgment or prejudice. I don't need to know your individual I know your group, therefore I get to put you in a category and treat you usually negatively. Discrimination is the treatment. If prejudice exists up here, I'm thinking discrimination exists in your doing, right? Unfair treatment of somebody usually based upon a prejudice, except when it's not. Our book kind of jumps into these different types of prejudice, like, you can be an unprejudiced discriminator, which means you discriminate even though you don't have an adverse opinion against somebody. That would be something like if you joined a social group, like a fraternity, and they discriminated, but you didn't really have beliefs, you just joined them because you liked the people or whatever. You would be an unprejudiced discriminator because you're supporting the group by being a part of it. So, all right, two types of discrimination that I think are worth talking about, and that is de jure and de facto. De jure, I think that's French. It is legal discrimination. So, before the civil rights movement, which was passed in the 60s, we had de jure discrimination. You could not live in a certain place if you were a person of color. That was the law. It was discriminatory by the legality. But we don't have very much of that anymore. I don't know if we have hardly any of that. I'm sure we do somewhere. But mostly what we have, the elephant in the room, is de facto discrimination. And de facto just means it's just the way it is. Like, it just exists, not because of any rule or law. And an example of that would be if you look at the richest neighborhoods of the United States cities, like, in Chicago, it's the northwest suburbs. Then what you're going to find is there's very few African Americans living there, and there's very few Latinos living there. It's mostly whites with a few Asians. And so you would say that's discrimination because there's not Latinos and African Americans or Native Americans there. And you would say, oh, are there laws against that? No, there's not. It's just de facto. It's because that in order to live there, you have to have a lot of money, and that excludes most African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans. So, moving on. Racial and ethnic stereotypes and discrimination. Again, more terms to try to understand discrimination and how it kind of flows in our society. Stereotypes are generalizations. We kind of talk about them a lot. It's sort of our brain's way of trying to group reality together to understand it, which makes it kind of sound kind of innocent, and perhaps it is on a neurological level, but we still get to decide to act on it or to agree with it, right? And so, if you meet 5 people on the street and they're all wearing blue shirts and they're all eating ice cream, then you see somebody else with a blue shirt and their back is turned toward you, your brain is going to stereotype and think that they're eating ice cream. You just can't see it because it's just an assumption about all members of the group. Blue-shirted people eat ice cream, right? Now that sounds very innocent. It's a lot more often things like all Chinese people are good at math, right? White men can't jump. African Americans are good in the bedroom. Things like that. That is, it's oftentimes negative. It can be positive, but even the positive, the book cautions against and says, it's really not good because you're not letting people be individuals. So when the Asian person wants to major in psychology, the advisors are like, "Oh, are you sure you want to do that? What about engineering?" Things like that. And so the person may be steered in a direction by the superiors, the authorities, they shouldn't really do that. So, what is a minority? For today's purposes, we are going to say it's a group that has less power than society's controlling group. So a minority in the United States would be women, at least for the moment. And why is that? Even though there's more women than there are men, is because they have less power in society's controlling group. Look at the Congress in the United States. Very few women there. right? So any group that is kind of can be like identified and said, yeah, these people have less power. So, racial and ethnic discrimination. This kind of just combines those two terms. You have a racial group or an ethnic group, and they are discriminated against because of their membership to that organization, to that minority status group. The racial group, they're discriminated against because of their racial group. And what does that look like? That looks like unequal access to jobs and housing and religious organizations, political activities, community services, right? Our book has several examples of how this might look. Race is as a social concept. So I kind of thought this was established fact, but it turns out it's not agreed upon fully. But here's the idea that race is a social category. We used to have lots of different racial groups in the United States. Not that we had different people than we do today. It was just that the categories that you would have been put into would be different. So for instance, 200 years ago, I would not have been considered white. I would have been considered something else. And so, but today I am considered white. Why? Because race is a social classification based upon physical characteristics, right? And so as the years have gone by, we've changed our definition of who belongs in what race. Okay? And so that, and race is not really scientific per se, because there's no like lines. So for instance, we could think about Africans, right? We could think about Africa as a continent, but it's not like people have stayed on the continent. No, there's been constant trade and intermingling and intermarriage and reproduction for thousands and thousands of years. And so the idea that these races that we have are these scientific groups that we can say, oh, okay, this is what this means to be African, or this is what this means to be European. It's like, no, we don't have there's no such thing as a pure race. And so it's just a way of society kind of just grouping people together. And why does society do that? Well, usually they do it because it has to do with power. We want to know how to treat people, based upon their race, which is kind of the definition of racism, right? And so perhaps that's why some people say we should throw out the idea of race. It doesn't help us because it just puts people into categories. And other people say no, because there are real differences in race. And so we could, the experts could throw it out, but the people are still going to hang on to it, and then we'll kind of lose the ability to talk about it because we've thrown it out. So that's why we hang on to it. All right, institutional racism and discrimination. So I am of the opinion that today racism is much more impactful, not on an individual basis, but on an institutional basis. So what am I talking about? An individual basis would be someone calling someone else a racial name, or not inviting them to lunch, or not I don't know, including them in some sort of activity. That would be like personal racism. And while that may sting and hurt, and there are consequences to that, and I guess also the extreme example of personal racism would be to murder somebody due to their race, and that occurs as well. Much more conscious of that due to the fact that, say, people of color are killed by police officers at much higher rates. But I'm still going to argue that institutional racism is more impactful, because institutional racism is going to impact what kind of job somebody gets, or what kind of schooling they get, or whether they are able to have impact in politics like other people. And I think those things impact more people more significantly. So for instance, a person of color in the United States is much more likely to get an inferior education compared to whites in the United States. And I think that sets somebody up to not get as good of a job, not, less likely to marry, more likely to earn a less money, more likely to be forced into retirement later on, more likely to die earlier. And so I think that that is where racism shows up more often than on a personal level. So we have a lot of slides to cover, so I'm kind of going through these a little bit faster than I maybe otherwise would. Let's talk about white privilege, and I see the irony here. White people, white men in particular, have privileges that other Americans do not have. What are we talking about here? White men rarely think about their race. And in fact, if you want to talk about race, white men are kind of like, yeah, it's not really for me. It doesn't really impact me. It's not something that I really understand, because white men don't think of themselves as having a race. They also don't think of themselves as having a gender, right? So if you want to talk about race and gender, white men are kind of like, yeah, it's not really something that impacts me, right? So white men rarely think about the fact that, having to worry about, are they going to be followed if they go into a store by somebody who maybe is afraid that they're going to steal something. White men rarely have to think about whether they're being ripped off at, say, the car dealership or the auto mechanics or by the plumber because of their race, right? All right, sources of prejudice and discrimination. Where is this stuff coming from? So realize that these are just a lot of different theories trying to explain why people or why society discriminates and oppresses. And so some of these maybe make more sense during certain times, and others may make more sense during other times. So for instance, projection is, this psychological idea that when we see something in ourselves that we don't like, it's hard to deal with because it's me. Whereas if we put that on someone else, because let's say I don't like the fact that I stutter, right? But rather than dealing with it, my own stuttering, I'll put it on somebody else. And so I'll notice it in another person, usually a weaker person, and I'll be like, oh, they're stuttering, what an idiot, blah, blah, blah. That's projection. Right? Okay, what else? Frustration and aggression. Right? This idea of a scapegoat. Life is hard. Life comes with challenges. Things don't always go the way that they're supposed to. You can try really hard and still not get what you want. And so wouldn't it be nice if you could just blame a people group for that problem? You could see the desirability of that. And so this is maybe one of the reasons why minority racial groups receive discrimination and oppression, because the masses or the dominant group is frustrated for a lot of different reasons, and so they're taking out their anger on the minority group. This is maybe one of the things that explains why during hard times there is more discrimination and oppression against racial minorities, because there's more frustration and aggression to be taken out, and it's hard to take it out on the real powerful people, the politicians or the corporate bosses, because those people are far away and very powerful. It's easier to pick on somebody much lower, so less powerful. So insecurity and inferiority. Maybe the dominant group is afraid that they're going to lose mates, they're going to lose their wealth, they're going to lose their house, something to lose, and so it's motivated by fear, right? People who appreciate strong leaders who are very like black and white, we are the good guys, they are the bad guys, they tend to also be pretty racist. History, you could say that it has to do with a history. In the past, these groups had more power, so therefore we're just continuing on that pattern. Competition and exploitation. People who are from other countries who immigrate to the United States tend to work for lower wages. And so if you are a worker in the United States, which most people are, you are not going to like that group because they are willing to undermine your wages. Socialization patterns, perhaps, family groups or media has taught us that certain people groups are inferior. Right? Belief in one true religion, and if that minority group is not part of that, then it becomes an excuse to treat them as less than. All right, moving on. Let's talk about the effects and costs of discrimination and oppression. All right, discrimination has psychological costs. Being treated less than, it hurts. It hurts mentally, right? We feel bad. What's going on? I'm trying to do things like everybody else is trying to do things, and yet I'm receiving bad feelings. I'm being left out. We are very social creatures. We like to be like everybody else, and when we are singled out, that really hurts us. So low self-esteem, life expectancy, loneliness. A few years ago, I learned that loneliness impacts us more than cigarettes, actually, especially if you're elderly. And so, if you are the person on the playground who's not being asked to join the kickball game, that can lead to isolation, and you may decide, you know what, it's too hard being friends with people, so I'm going to live a life where I don't really have any friends, I just have some acquaintances, and so that impacts our health, and then ultimately how long we live, right? And then national political goals. If we are fighting with ourselves, then it is difficult for us to compete with other countries. It's also difficult for us to be a positive influence on other countries. When we try to tell other countries, like China, for instance, hey, you shouldn't kill your religious minorities, they're like, well, you don't believe in equality either, right? And we're like, yeah, but you shouldn't. You see, it kind of just takes away from our ability to be a positive role model. So I do want to talk about intersectionality. Intersectionality is the kind of the meeting of two minority statuses together. So let's say you're a person of color and you are a member of a minority religion. That puts you even more likely to be the victim of discrimination or oppression. All right. Understanding the background material for racial groups. We're going to talk about a few of these racial groups and kind of what's going on, or some major themes in their life. But realize that while there are these kind of major themes going on in people's lives, we are still individuals. And I emphasize that because it is very common psychologically for us to assume that if somebody comes from Sweden and say they don't like coffee, we're going to assume that Swedes don't like coffee. But they are an individual, and maybe they're just different from the rest of the group. So while it's good to realize that there's all these things that impact minority groups, historically, currently, they are still individuals. So we want to kind of hold both individual and the social common things. If you can appreciate both of those, it will allow you to connect with people who are different from yourself so much better. So you might say, like, I know that it's common in this culture, but tell me, well, I don't know if that's a great example, but you could say something like, hey, what do you think about, one example here is the machismo culture. How does that impact you? And so what you're not saying like, oh, I know that you believe this. I'm curious. I'm bringing an understanding of general knowledge, but I'm not saying that it specifically applies to you. And so I think that's gonna. I think that someone who is Latino might appreciate that. It's like, oh, you know a little bit, but you're also not assuming that I am like the rest of my group. So doing something like that, I think, would be really good. And maybe the example is not good, but I think that in general, bringing that to the table communicates that you care about them and their culture. Let's start talking about African Americans. They are the second largest minority group in the United States. By the way, there's a book that came out, I think 2019, and it was very controversial. And people were saying things like, "It's demonic and it's anti-American and it's Marxist." And I was like, I got to read that clearly if that's all those things. And so I did. And the book is called The 1619 Project. I didn't get very far through it actually, but about 100 and some odd pages. And I was really I was really impressed with what it had to say. And in essence, the main theme is that it's trying to understand American history through the lens of enslavement of Africans in this country. And I just thought it was a really, really interesting perspective, and I just really had an appreciation for it. And I think that it is. I think that it's good, and especially if you're going to be working with African Americans in any sort of helping profession, it would be good to understand some historical background for this group. So the book points out that we can look at African Americans rather than what's going wrong, which is typically what we talk about, but we look at it through strengths, right? So that's what I'm going to focus on here today. One of the things that is strong about African American families today is that there's a strong kinship bond, and that is going to extend outside of just the nuclear family of mom and dad and kids, but it's going to extend to aunts and uncles and grandparents, and those kinship bonds are stronger, certainly stronger than they are in white culture. So, an orientation toward work. Very, very common for people to prize working in poverty, oftentimes multiple jobs, and having that as important, and passing on that work ethic to the next generation is very important. Adaptable family roles. During enslavement, families were broken apart routinely, and then after the factories left the United States in like the 70s, a lot of African American men lost their jobs, and the African American family has become adapted so that if the male men fathers are present, then they'll play that role, but if they're not present, that oftentimes mothers or other family members will play that role in children's lives. Religious orientation. The African American church is very strong and plays an important role in building identity and community for those. Moving on to Latinos. I think we actually have a slide for that. Moving on to Hispanics, I said Latinos, but these terms are oftentimes interchangeable, and in fact, I think they're even here. Hispanics are people who speak a language that is Spanish, right? So that can include Spain, and it can include, most of South America, Central America, and then Mexico, which I believe is part of North America. And Latinos has to do more with I think it excludes Spain and includes other places in South America that speak Portuguese, like Brazil. So I was really confident of that before I read the book, and the book's definition just threw me off, so I apologize if I'm wrong here. A couple of things I just want to point out regarding Hispanic culture. Is a little bit more traditional culture, and Hispanics in the United States are oftentimes, kind of trying to think about, like, do you kind of stick to the old sort of ways of Latin America, where like there's strict gender roles, and a father has a lot of power, and he's the one working, or sort of transitioning to an Americanized version of culture. And so that is important to realize when you work with people who are Hispanic. An appreciation for family. Family is very, very important, and oftentimes the relationship between the father and their children is more significant, I guess, and more important than the relationship between the wife and the husband. And so, again, that doesn't mean it's for everybody, and it's good to kind of realize that might be going on, but you can ask about that sort of thing. Um, so let's move on. Looking at Native Americans obviously were here before Europeans showed up. In my mind, they represent a conquered group of people who have been pushed to sort of the margins geographically, to land that was not desirable by European farmers. And there's kind of two groups today, as I understand it. There are those that are living on the reservations and trying to maintain a piece of what the lifestyle and culture of what they had before, and then there are those who have entered mainstream American culture or European culture, and are working jobs, going to school, kind of doing what I think of as most Americans doing. So I think there's like 1.5% to 2% of the population that is Native American. So Asian Americans have done pretty well in the United States recently. It was not always this way. If you look specifically at Japanese Americans, they came in the 1800s. I think it was the late 1800s, and they were largely on the West Coast, and received discrimination. And then also during World War II, when we were fighting against the Japanese, Japanese Americans were considered suspect, that maybe they would turn or act as spies for the Japanese. Chinese Americans came over in large numbers to help with building infrastructure projects in the United States, also for the gold rush, also receiving recipients of discrimination, not allowed to marry white women, and we passed laws to ban their drugs, even though they were fairly similar to the ones that other people were taking. As of recently, they're pretty economically and educationally successful. Discipline and bringing honor to the family is a pretty important part of Asian culture, specifically Chinese, and that it allowed them to do really well in our society. But that doesn't mean they're still not receiving racism. There were a lot of Americans during the COVID outbreak that blamed COVID on the Chinese. Strategies for advancing economic and social justice. So a couple ideas on how we could make things better in terms of how, as we as a society, could get along better. And and maybe you're white and thinking like, well, what does that have to do with me? The truth is that as a nation, we want the best of everybody. Like, people have gifts and talents and abilities, and if you discriminate against a people group, you're not going to get their best. You're not going to get your best from them because they are being kicked aside. Psychologically, that's going to impact them. And so they're just not going to do as well. So anything you can do to bring out the best in a people group is going to be good for the whole. Yeah, it might seem on an individual basis that maybe they're taking out something that you would like to have, like, oh, they're moving into the house that I would like to buy, or they're moving into the job that I would like to have. But that's kind of shallow thinking, really, because it's going to cause the other members to say, oh, okay, what are they doing well that maybe I can glean? I can kind of borrow their ideas to do those same things. Right? And we live in a global economy. And so their success is our success because it enriches our country, even if that's just selfish. So moving on, what are we talking about here? Mass media appeals, billboards, advertisement, getting a celebrity to talking about this and how we could make things better. That kind of works, not really. Our book says that doesn't really work that well overall, and so greater interaction among the races. That was one of the major things that we tried to do with, like, busing kids from different schools, around. We wanted to integrate more things. I like that idea. I think that it works sometimes, like for instance, when everyone has the same goal. So for instance, sports teams members or people in the military, those relationships are really, really good. But other times it doesn't work. Other times it actually backfires. And so it's good if it's done right, and if it's not, then it may not do well at all. So kind of the same thing with these diversity programs at companies. During 2021, when there's a lot of racial tension, and there were protests, a lot of companies said, "Oh well, we do we do diversity training," and so kind of quickly tried to kind of convince people that they were doing it right. And those don't actually work that well. I think they would work. It's just that a lot of them that we do don't actually. They're not that effective. So it's a good idea. I think we should keep trying, but maybe it's like the DARE program. Like it was a good idea, but it ended up not being that effective. So, all right, back on track. Civil rights laws. Those were really good. Those people that actually changed a lot of things. Whenever a politician or a law comes along that says, "Oh well, these people group are as good as the rest of us," that's kind of like has a domino effect. It may take a while to kind of reach it, but if the opposite happens too, when a politician stands up and says, "Oh, these people group are bad," even if they don't say it like that, even they're kind of like, "Oh well, that people group." There's a bunch of crazy people who were like, "Oh, if that politician hinted at the fact that this people group isn't as good, well, now I feel permission to just, go out and shoot them." So laws and politicians actually have a big impact, even just for like the suggestions, just kind of like leading the way for the people. So activism. This is where you're holding signs. You're going to the powerful people and saying, "Hey, we need this to change." That actually makes a lot of a difference too, especially if you can get the media involved and you can be organized about it. That seems to really move the needle. Affirmative action programs. The way we think about it today, which is very different from when it was first passed back in, I think, the 50s or the 60s, is we give preferential treatment to minorities. First of all, this is very controversial. The reality is most of these affirmative action programs benefit women because they're also minorities, but I think it's going to end. If I was a betting man, I would bet that affirmative action programs are going to be over in the next 10 years. Which I think is an unfortunate thing, because while I do understand the argument of reverse discrimination, I think that overall it creates opportunities for people who are part of groups that would never get into, say, elite universities, and today are able to get into those because of affirmative action programs. And so while I understand that it may not be strictly fair to everybody, it doesn't create equality. The idea, it's not supposed to create equality. It's supposed to tilt the scales to the benefit of a people group who have historically had the scales weighed against them. So it's trying to undo the past discrimination by, I guess, the reverse discrimination. All right, even if you want to call it that, it's like, okay, but still, I think that overall it makes it it does more harm than good. So, but I'll get off that. All right, what else? This is more on an individual basis, which maybe is simpler because the others require a lot more organized and long-term action. When you are hanging out with other people and they say things like, "Oh, well, those Jews," or things like that, that's an opportunity to be like, "Hey, don't joke like that." Is it awkward? Is it maybe mean you're going to lose some friends? You might, right? But I don't know. If your friend is so easily lost, were they a true friend anyway? Again, not that easy, but I think that is an opportunity on an individual basis, for all different types of groups. When someone says, in a group of guys, "Hey, don't be a sissy," it's an opportunity to say, "Hey, joke about something else, because I got a sister, and she's pretty cool, so stop," and so that helps on an individual basis, because it causes racists to kind of retreat and say, like, "Well, I can't talk openly about my racism, and so that tends to be a positive thing because our words create ways of seeing the world. We see the world through language. Take away our language or change the language, and you're going to change the way people see the world. So, all right, minority-owned businesses. Rather than, so some minorities, especially if you're in inner city and you're a person of color, maybe you're a religious minority, you may say, I can't get a job. Well, one option is to make a job, start your own business, and then you can hire other people who are in your similar position. And so that does a few things. One, it empowers the individual, and it causes other people who maybe are giving out racism to say, oh, well, that person is doing well. They're organizing their own business. I didn't know they could do that. So it kind of begins to challenge some of the racist rhetoric that exists. So asset-based community development focuses on what people have, their assets, their skills, their capacities as a community, and gets the people who are most impacted, who have the most to gain by changing a community. If I'm from the outside coming in, it's much harder for me to create lasting change than if somebody who was already living in that community, who already knows people in that community, who has so much more to gain by things going well than somebody from the outside. So trying to organize the community to make things better. I was thinking about the drugs and drug dealers who operate in communities. It's very difficult for someone from the outside to come in to kind of try to clean up the streets. But if somebody already lives there, they know who's being impacted, and if they say, hey, Tuesday night we're going to come together and I'm going to try to bring 10 community people who are going to try to talk about what can we do to have it so we don't have drug dealers on our streets. That could be a really powerful thing if those people are willing to take the chances, of potentially being killed to try to change things. But a lot more likely to be effective than some outside force coming in or creating new laws or things like that. All right, what is social work's commitment to ending this issue? So there are types of social work practice that focus on being multicultural. So to be a multicultural social worker, it's incorporating your understanding of the people that you work with that maybe are different from yourself, right? With the things that normally would work, that are always working, right? So it's like, so you have you have the training of a social worker and the tools that you would normally have, but you also on top of that have an understanding of the people groups that you're working with, especially those minority people groups. And so I'm looking for the term there. Yeah. Okay. So one of the things I'll point out here is that one of the things that you have to go beyond just being nice is because a lot of times minority groups, all groups, not even just minorities, we have unspoken rules about how you're supposed to do things, right? I don't even know what the unspoken rules are of my culture because it's all I've ever known. I just know that you just don't break these rules, and I can't even tell you what they are until I see someone breaking them. And so from someone who's not part of my culture comes in and they break those rules, I can't necessarily tell them that they broke the rules because I'm going to assume they already know them and they broke them on purpose, right? So that's why it's important to have an understanding of the culture for the people that you work with. Right? Now, most people don't. I'll just be honest. Most people don't. I don't most of the time. But guess what? I lose people. I lose clients. I lose the opportunity to be able to create an impact because I have offended people in a way that I don't even realize, and maybe they don't even realize it. because again, they're just kind of used to people following these rules, and when they don't follow the rules, it's because they mean to break them, because they want to be insulting, or they're trying to communicate power or something like that. So the more understanding that you and I can have about the unspoken rules or the ways of living among minority groups, it increases our ability to connect with them and to help them. So empowerment is a big part of this. Empowerment is about increasing the strength that a person has, right? Focusing on what they are able to do rather than what they're not able to do. So helping, viewing somebody not as a victim of society, not as a victim of even their own bad choices, but saying, you know what, you have some things that you can do, you have some power that you can draw on, let's see what we can do with that, right? Cultural competency has to do with understanding your own culture and how it's impacted your own thought process, seeing your own ethnocentrism, and then advocating for minorities. So culturally competent has to do a lot with like internal, like focusing on like, okay, why do I believe that? Why do I believe that if other people groups don't, right? It's just kind of being curious about it. And then the last thing here is cultural humility. I understand that, for instance, for me, being a white male allows me certain privileges that other people don't get if they're not a white male, right? So just realizing that power imbalance. Maybe I can change things, maybe I can't, but it's good for me just to know that I am bringing that to the table when I talk to people. So this is going to keep me from getting so frustrated sometimes. I still get frustrated sometimes when I'm working with clients, and I'm like, why can't you just change this? Why don't you just do this? Why don't you just talk to that person and tell them to bug off? But I can step back and say, okay, wait a minute. Maybe I can do that being white male. Maybe they can't. I don't know. But it's kind of just bringing that question to your mind. All right. Oh, so here we go. Some of these guidelines: being aware of your own culture, learning about their culture, especially cultures where people you're going to work with. If you're not going to work with people, say, from South Asian descent, I mean, it's like it's okay to learn about them, but if you're going to be working with, say, Latinos who are primarily from Puerto Rico, you might want to focus more on that than the other culture. So. What can you do to adapt the skills and interventions to best serve clients? In white culture especially, we're very independent, and so if I'm doing an intake, if I'm going in for an intake as a client, I'm probably going to go alone, whereas if I was, say, I don't know, Filipino, I might bring my family with me. Right? And so if the social worker is not understanding that, they may say, well, wait a minute, why are you bringing all these extra people? We want to work on you. And so they might try to convince the client, me, to leave my family behind. But that's not really an appreciation for the way I'm coming from, and it's not really adapting the skills to the diverse group, right? So number 6 here, I think, is really important. Being aware of what is available to people, right? And then helping them get connected with those resources. Maybe there are church services that are in their language. Maybe there is a group of people that are similar to your client that exist to support people like your client. Being aware of those groups. All right, for the sake of time, we gotta finish here. Oh my gosh, 53 minutes. Okay, what is the future? I said I had a crystal ball. I don't actually have a crystal ball. Here's the 3 options that our book says are going. One of these 3 is likely going to happen. One is that we are all going to conform to British ways of doing things. In many ways we do this right now, right? We speak a British language. Our economy is really focused on British ideas about capitalism. We have I don't know. The analogy is breaking down there. Oh, we have an appreciation for the Beatles. Anyway, so we may continue down that road of just kind of everybody just kind of adopts the language and the culture by the Anglo is British, and so we kind of follow in the footsteps of Britain, or we could become a melting pot. I don't know that we've actually melted, but I guess in some ways we have. For instance, we have lots of languages spoken in the United States, and we have lots of food, ethnic restaurants in the United States, and we kind of borrowed from a lot of different culture. Even the English language, if you wonder why it's spelled so weird, it's because that's what English did. It took the words from other languages and kept their pronunciation and their spelling, right? Which is why it's so difficult to spell words like enough, right? It should be E-N-U-F, right? But it's not. Why? Because it comes from another language, and we just kept its spelling when we brought it over. So we could do more melting pot, which is kind of like everybody kind of has to become like the dominant culture, but the dominant culture is kind of always changing and bringing in new parts from other places. Or a lot of social workers are hoping for cultural pluralism, which is sort of allowing people to hang on to their cultural identities and ways of doing things while still living and existing equally in the United States. So, as for me, my money is on melting pot. I think the idea of cultural pluralism is cool. It's just hard for me to believe that it's going to be more of an impact. It's just going to actually happen more so than melting pot. I think the forces that cause new immigrants to learn English and we bring them to our schools where they melt in with the other kids is just really powerful. And our media causes people to melt. So I think that the melting pot is probably the one that's going to continue to happen. So thank you for watching all the way to the end. This was a really long chapter. That's maybe why this talk is an hour long. I will try not to do that in the future.